Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. This last week we had a bit of drama with a big confidence vote, and it's a bit of a reminder of what minority parliaments can look like. Oftentimes we hear people say, hung parliaments are so great because they force all the parties to work together and so on and so on. And in my life as a political reporter, that's never really been the case. There's this kind of nostalgic glow about the 1950s and 60s with the Pearson and Diefenbaker minority governments where they kind of alternated back and forth, but a lot of stuff got done. But this is somewhat hindsight bias in terms of, attributing what was a massive expansion of the welfare state across the Western world to the kinds of stuff that was endemic to a hung parliament. And I don't know that it's necessarily really that these things got done because it was a hung parliament, but rather because that's what the mood was across pretty much every country in the Western world. So we do get a lot of this kind of glow around, aren't minority parliaments great? Certain advocates of things like proportional representation like to, I'm trying to think of the right word here. They like to project upon these situations this kind of idealized notion that in these other countries, for example, in Scandinavian countries where hung parliaments as a result of proportional representation are the norm, that all this wonderful stuff gets done. But it's also an example of trade-offs in terms of, sure, they may have expanded social programs in these countries, but that's because peace often comes in their parliaments as a result of spending money. And they don't always have the balance sheets to certainly demonstrate that, that the trade-off, again, I guess, would be the balance sheet of the country and debts and deficits and so on. So there's a lot of things to consider. When it comes to what happened here in Canada in this last week, part of that is as a result of basically the way the seat math is working out, and also as a result of the new Conservative leader, Erin O'Toole, basically doing a lot of chest thumping and trying to sound tough in terms of what he's saying around the Trudeau government. As a result of that, we saw this motion around what they called an anti-corruption committee, which is inflammatory in and of itself. There's no actual charges of corruption that's going on, corruption being, a serious criminal matter. None of what has happened with the WE imbroglio or anything around it has reached the level of criminality. There was some sloppiness in terms of the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister not recusing themselves from that decision. But in other respects, I mean, there's been no actual misappropriated funds, and there have been no actual instances of friends and family of the government getting preferential deals or having money funneled to them in any particular way. As much as what went on with WE is somewhat distasteful, particularly given that all the spotlight that shone on WE basically caused it to fold much of its Canadian operation. I think it's important to realize what is and is not corruption, and nothing that has happened here rises to that level. So to call this supposed special committee an anti-corruption committee was inflammatory, and it was designed to get a response. And it's also about trying to set a message in terms of, if this doesn't go ahead, then the government is hiding their corruption. And that's really kind of childish gamesmanship, and part of this ethos around, you know, the kind of things that they can put on social media to try and make things all the more outrageous. And that's part of the problem with where we are in our political discourse right now. But in this particular situation, the government basically realized that this motion had been stacked in a certain way that would have had a fairly paralyzing effect on government, because the way in which the terms of reference for that committee would have been would essentially have put the government and the civil service on notice that they were to basically drop everything and turn everything over to this committee on whim. And this was essentially an excuse for expanded fishing expeditions and so on. So there was, you know, people who did not actually read the motion, thought it was fairly pedestrian. We heard a lot of talk about never in 150 years has there been a confidence motion on a creation of a committee. But it wasn't really a creation of a committee. It was a way of both trying to stifle the government's ability to get its agenda out the door, as well as just the fact that the very notion that if you're considering the government corrupt, then you will have lost confidence in them. And that is essentially what the government basically said. And to their credit, I mean, this is I think something that we should be realizing. It would be a loss of confidence in any government who is accused of funneling, money to friends or family or so on. Misappropriation of funds is serious, and the role of MPs is to safeguard the public purse. So if you're saying that the government has not spent money wisely and so on, that is a pretty much automatic loss of confidence. And basically, Justin Trudeau called out Aaron O'Toole in saying that if you're saying that his government's corrupt, then, stand up and prove it. And proving it would be a confidence vote. So this is kind of where we got to. And then O'Toole prevaricated and said, well, I don't have confidence, but I don't want an election. And that's not how things work. And people have, tried to say, well, couldn't the other parties go to the Governor General and try and form an alternative government? That's also not really how things work. That really only happens in a context where there's just been an election and there would be an alternate rather than going directly right to the polls a second time. That's what happened in BC. It happened in New Brunswick, and those are New Brunswick has since had another election. Higgs got a majority. BC is currently having an election. We will find out in a few days whether or not John Horgan gets a majority there, although the polls make it sound likely. But with this in mind, we also had people saying, well, obviously the Prime Minister wants an election because, he's seeing what's happening in these other provinces where, minority parliaments or legislatures or hung parliaments, I guess, turned into majority governments. I don't know that was actually necessarily the case. I don't think there's been nearly enough accomplished for him to try and even make that case to the voting public. But I think this was simply a question of calling out O'Toole and his rhetoric. And it seems to have worked. They've wrested control of the agenda back. We'll see if this other motion around the health committee passes or fails or gets modified in some regard, because it has similar shenanigan-y language in terms of insisting that the department basically drop everything and produce 2.5 years worth of emails within days, which is ridiculous and crazy. And certainly an abuse of parliamentary process, but that's kind of where we are. So I just kind of wanted to have a few moments to reflect on kind of what happened, and just to kind of push back to some of the narratives that were out there. This was not a confidence vote based solely on a committee. It was a confidence vote based on a series of parliamentary shenanigans, where the government basically had to exert some form of control, or they were going to basically lose control of the agenda entirely. And so I think with that particular frame in mind, I think it was a perfectly legitimate excuse. It did put the opposition parties on notice that they needed to kind of decide what they're doing. The NDP tried to frame the narrative in a way that, Trudeau wants an election and I'm not going to give it to him, which is kind of ridiculous, because if Trudeau wanted an election, he could go to Rideau Hall and dissolve Parliament at any time he wanted. So that narrative doesn't really hold water either. But essentially, this is kind of the state of where we are. I think this may have bought the government a few more weeks, possibly a few more months of relative stability in terms of being able to get some stuff done through the door. We are seeing the introduction of a lot more legislation right now. It is finally starting to move through the process. It will start hitting the Senate within a few weeks. And maybe by that point the Senate will have their committees up and running, but that is a whole other topic. This is kind of the state of where we're at right now. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith, that's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks everyone.